1982, over 10,000 Argentine troops seized control of the Falkland Islands and declared this British colony was now Argentine.
They were quite forceful and it was scary. They had what I would have called a Nazi-orientated discipline about them.
Each time we were taken out, they pointed the guns at the children, and you knew that the guns were loaded.
He said the best solution would be to kill all the Falkland Islanders, and then there wouldn't be a population to worry about.
I wasn't afraid to die. I just felt sort of quite numb at that stage.
I remember trying to sleep, and every time a bomb went off, actually physically lifting off the floor.
Just trying to get someone out of the back of a BV that's had their leg blown off. You know, the screams, it was a nightmare.
At dawn on the 2nd of April 1982, Charlie Mackenzie was on duty at the Cape Pembroke Lighthouse in a remote part of East Falkland.
It was early hours of the morning and I was looking to see if there was anything around when I spotted the ship. The silhouette of the boat was you could see on the water, because it was quite dark. But looking with glasses on the water, you could tell. And then just before daylight, that's when the Archies came in ashore. And that's when we knew they were there. Didn't know what the hell to think. What to do, anything. None of us knew what to bloody do, because we'd never seen a war before in our lives. Never seen anything like that taking place.
What Charlie Mackenzie saw that morning in 1982 were military landing craft. It was the start of the Argentine invasion of the Falkland Islands, a war in which nearly 1,000 would lose their lives. This is the story of the Falklands War, told by the people who lived through it, the islanders. Men and women who, for a few months, found themselves thrust onto the world's stage. Many of their stories have never been heard before. Stories of great courage and heroism, of enormous love and loss. The population of nearly 2,000 were largely of British descent. And before the War of 1982, many worked on sheep farms belonging to landowners in the United Kingdom. It was a very tranquil way of life. But this peaceful existence was about to change. By February 1982, Argentina's long simmering dispute with Britain over the ownership of the islands had reached boiling point. The islanders' lives had now become haunted by fear and suspicion. At the Falkland Islands broadcasting station, radio announcer Patrick Watts was keeping his ears tuned to an increasing number of curious incidents.
There were odd lights being seen, strange landings of aircraft on Stanley Airport. Aircraft landed, had a fuel problem, but took off fairly quickly again. Didn't seem to have been anybody working on it.
Reg Sylvie, an amateur radio enthusiast, had been monitoring the airwaves and listening in to radio hams in Argentina.
We knew that something was going on. From an amateur radio point of view, we knew for certain that there was going to be an invasion by the attitude of the amateurs in Argentina. It was much to the effect that soon we would all be Argentinian.
As the tension mounted, everyone was feeling nervous. Even the children could sense the fear. Lisa Watson was 12 at the time.
I understood what was going on because my parents were always very aware, politically aware, and they would often speak about it with their friends and colleagues in the house. They would talk about the Argentines, the political situation, the possibility of an invasion. So all my life it was something of a cloud, a shadow hanging over me.
Despite the islanders' concerns, the Falklands were poorly defended with just a token force of Royal Marines stationed there. Major Mike Norman arrived in late March 1982 to relieve an outgoing detachment of Marines. At the time, the islands were seen as a very pleasant and relaxing posting.
My Sergeant Major and I had very definite views how we were going to run our detachment. We had in our mind fishing clubs, walking clubs, shooting clubs. We were going hunting, shooting, fishing and recreational training for a year, we thought.
Other than the Royal Marines, the only protection between the islanders and the Argentine army was the Falkland Islands Defence Force, the FIDF, a small band of local volunteers, armed but not very dangerous.
Although I was, strictly speaking, a member of the FIDF, I'd only been there twice. I'd fired nothing more lethal than a catapult in my life. I think only a few members of the FIDF had actually had any military experience whatsoever. One of the guys was ex-Royal Marine. And the guys in charge, they did the best they could under the circumstances with the knowledge they had available.
The islanders had feared the worst for many months. Suspicion became reality on the 1st of April 1982 when the island's governor, Rex Hunt, received a short telegram from Britain.
It said, we have apparently reliable evidence that an Argentine task force will gather off Cape Pembroke near Stanley early tomorrow morning, 2nd of April. Stop. You will wish to make your dispositions accordingly. Stop. And that's all I ever got from the Foreign Office. When my assistant brought the thing in, he gave it to me and he said, well, they might have said goodbye in the best of British.
I looked at Rex Hunt and said, it's after midday, isn't it? April Fool's Day's over. And he said, it looks like the silly buggers mean it this time.
And mean it, they certainly did. The Argentines were preparing to invade. Rex Hunt went on the local radio and announced the news to the shocked islanders.
I have an important announcement to make about the state of affairs between the British and Argentine governments over the Falkland Islands dispute. There is mounting evidence that the Argentine armed forces are preparing to invade the Falkland Islands. Here in Stanley, I have alerted the Royal Marines, and I ask now for all serving members, all active members of the Falkland Islands Defence Force to report to the drill hall as soon as possible. I shall come on the air again as soon as I have anything to report. But in the meantime, I would urge you all to remain calm and to keep off the streets.
I was a little frightened by it because they were talking about ships coming, Argentine ships. But I do remember his last words were that the children won't be going to school tomorrow. And I remember thinking, oh, thank goodness for that, because I hadn't done my maths homework. So that was actually quite good.
At Government House, chauffeur Don Bonner was bravely preparing to defend his country.
Oh, I went into the dining room cupboard where I kept all the flags, and I got the biggest Union Jack I could find, and I took it out and put it up. And I went back into the house, and I got the shotgun and went into the rod room. And I said, I'm going to stay here, and the first RG bastard I see touching that flag, I'm going to blow his bloody head off.
The first sign that the invasion force had arrived came at dawn on the 2nd of April. Argentine Special Forces attacked the Royal Marine Barracks at Moody Brook, just to the west of Stanley. Fraser Wallace was on sentry duty outside the FIDF headquarters and heard the blast.
I went inside and I said to the OC of the FIDF, Major Summers, I said, Phil, I think they've hit Moody Brook. Phil came outside and there was dead silence. He put a fatherly arm around my shoulder and said, "Don't worry, son, it's your nerves playing up, you'll be all right." Next thing was an almighty explosion that way. He said, "Jesus Christ, I've hit Moody Brook." So that was the start of it all, really.
At the time of the explosion, Moody Brook was empty. The Royal Marines were already in defensive positions around Stanley. One group were lying in wait at a beach where invading troops were expected to land.
Our intelligence was poor in as much that we thought the amphibious landings would take place by landing craft. And we protected the beach, which we thought was suitable for landing craft. We did not know that the Argentinians used a swimming amphibious vehicle, which prefers a shallow beach. So we defended the wrong beach.
Meanwhile, the island's radio station was covering the story of its life, the world's first invasion phone-in.
I opened up the microphone fader and I just said, "Look, tell me what you can see. Tell me what you can hear. If you tell me, I can tell other people." And suddenly the program started.
This is the governor speaking. Those of you who are living in Stanley will have heard some shots, some confused shooting. We do not know yet what that's all about, but we have had sightings of an aircraft.
We had a chap called Tom Davies, who was a Welshman, and he's ringing me up and telling me, I can see the stars, I can see the sky. And I said, "Tom, it's too dangerous to be out, you know." And he said, "No, boyo, I can see through the hole in the roof." You know, he had a shell through his roof. It was unbelievable.
The invading army had reached the capital, Stanley, and the defending Marines were hopelessly outnumbered. Major Mike Norman ordered all sections to fall back into the grounds of Government House. For the islanders, the future was looking very bleak. In April 1982, an Argentine military force landed on the Falkland Islands and marched towards the seat of government in Stanley. Their aim was to seize these tiny British islands and put them under Argentine control.
There was one stage where there was a horrendous noise, and my husband then went and had a look out of the window, and there was one of the big personnel carriers going past the house. The guns were pointing right at the house. It was a horrible moment, because you really didn't know at that point if you're going to make it through.
Shortly after dawn on the 2nd of April, the invading troops were heading for Government House to reinforce Argentine special forces. A handful of British Marines were bravely trying to defend the governor against the attack.
I was sure that with all that noise going on and the shooting, that we would have had casualties. And I could hear somebody groaning from where I was in my office. And I said to Mike Norman, I said, "Look, we better get our wounded in." And he said, "Oh, they're not ours, they're theirs." And that was the first time I realized how close they got to us. There were 3 of them that had been shot by our Marines in my wife's vegetable garden.
As the battle continued, the Argentine amphibious personal carriers, known as Amtraks, were getting closer to Government House.
We were holding our own quite well against the special forces. We had 3 prisoners. We had 3 bodies laying out the back, one very badly wounded and 2 others badly wounded. We were quieting down the sniper fire from up in the hills, but We had very little chance of winning the battle at Government House. It was only a matter of time. The Amtrak is not a very formidable weapon. It's got a .6 machine gun, I think, and it's got fairly heavy armour on it. But it's a formidable weapon if you've only got rifles and modern-day bazookas to fire at it.
Governor Rex Hunt was determined to keep the islanders informed. Radio presenter Patrick Watts was told to do his best to keep broadcasting.
Said to me, oh, and you ought to keep the radio station on for as long as possible. So I didn't say, well, hang on a minute, I don't know if I want to do that. He was the governor. And you just did what the governor told you in those days. So I knew what he meant. Keep it going until the Argentines walked in.
But I'm hopeful that they'll send somebody in to talk.
And you'll talk to them, will you, sir?
I'll talk to them, but I'm not walking out. I'm not surrendering to the bloody arches, Patrick, certainly not.
Fantastic. Well done, sir. Thank you.
The radio was the most important part of communication. In between the messages that I was giving from Government House, music was being played by Patrick. After we heard about the Amtraks coming in, Patrick put on Strangers in the Night. Thank goodness the British sense of humour came through. It was helping people not to be frightened.
Strangers in the night, exchanging glances, wandering in the night. What were the chances we'd be sharing love before the night was through?
It's a bit sort of a surreal situation where your mind is listening to what's going on the radio, but then it's happening in the street. And the climax sort of comes when suddenly what they've been talking about on the radio appears in front of your window, which was armed soldiers and armoured personnel carriers and Argentines toting guns and shouting and muttering at you to keep away from the windows and pointing guns at you. And then suddenly you think, well, hang on a minute, what I've been listening to is not a radio play, it's real.
While the battle at Government House continued, the residents of Stanley were warned to stay in their houses. But for one man, not even war was going to stop his daily routine.
Bullets were winging through Government House, bouncing and ricocheting off the tarmac road in front of Government House, when one of my lads shouted back to the sergeant in charge. He said, there's a bloke coming down the road, Sergeant. He said, well, tell him to go away, go back home. So Turner put his head out of the hedge and shouted, wait, go home. And this chap shouted back, it's all right for you lot, but some of us have got to go to work. As if we were on some exercise and we're just buggering up their day.
The handful of Marines managed to hold their own, and so far, no British had been killed. The enemy was suffering heavy losses, until Argentine reinforcements arrived. The courageous Marines were soon outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. To avoid needless loss of life, Rex Hunt made a crucial decision.
I decided to surrender because I knew that if I had kept on saying fight, Mike Norman and his men would have carried on until they were dead. And I realised that was quite unnecessary.
I had two reactions really. One, as a Royal Marine, I was slightly annoyed. As a man who was responsible for the lives of 68 Marines and 10 sailors, I was very relieved because Rex Hunt was making a decision that wasn't available to me.
But Mike Norman still had one trick up his sleeve. He ordered 6 Marines to slip out of Stanley with the idea that after the surrender, they would continue a guerrilla campaign in the countryside. While these Marines were dispatched on their mission, a makeshift white flag was hastily assembled. Rex Hunt's deputy, Dick Baker, and a translator bravely ventured out of Government House to discuss surrender with the Argentine command.
The walk did seem a long walk. Seemed rather funny too, in a way, because here was I with this umbrella with a Government House curtain attached to it. And one of the last things Rex had said to me, typical British humour, was, look after that umbrella, Dick, cost me a lot of money in Piccadilly. I was fairly certain we were going to be shot at. There were hundreds of Argentine troops commanding that ridge above Government House and overlooking the road along the front there, all with their rifles pointing down towards the road. And the chances were that even with white flags, somebody was going to be trigger happy. In fact, there were a couple of shots loosed off at us, but fortunately they weren't very good ones. But I thought there was a very good chance I'd be killed.
Meanwhile, back inside Government House, everyone prepared to meet the Argentines with their pride and dignity intact.
Sir Rex had emerged from underneath the table, and he brushed himself down, he tidied his hair, and he sat behind his desk, and in came Admiral Carlos Bucer, tall, must be over 6 foot, in American fatigues, and before he could say a word, Rex Hunt looked at him up in the air and said, "This is British territory. We don't want you here, you're not invited, and I want you to leave now and to take all your men with you." And Bucer had the grace to smile, and he said, "I'm here, I've got 200 men ashore, I've got another 800 men waiting to come ashore. We don't want to cause any damage to civilians, and we don't want to kill these men who've put up such a brave fight. I think you should surrender now." And Rex looked at him and thought for a minute and said, "In that case, you give me no option. I will tell my men to lay down their weapons."
So far, there had been no response from Britain. But the Argentines were about to make a big mistake. One that would make the world sit up and take notice. The Royal Marines were led outside and forced to lie face down on the ground while a photograph was taken. This picture of the humiliated Royal Marines appeared on the front pages of newspapers all over the world. As the Argentine flag was raised at Government House, the islanders realized they were now at the mercy of a brutal military junta.
At that stage, they'd murdered tens of thousands of their own people who were dissenting, and they regarded us as Argentines, not Falkland Islanders, so one has to ask why they should treat us any differently.
The occupation of the Falklands had begun. On the 2nd of April 1982, the Falkland Islands were seized by the brutal Argentine military junta. The ruthless General Galtieri had ruled Argentina since 1981. Under his leadership, citizens were tortured, there were illegal arrests, thousands disappeared, and tens of thousands were simply murdered. The islanders were now under the control of this brutal regime.
El día en que se dio el primer grito libertario de nuestra República Argentina naciente.
They were hoping that the population here would welcome them with open arms. So they were hoping that all we would do would be say, "Thanks very much for invading us, you've got rid of our top-heavy leadership, and now you're taking over, so we'll carry on as normal." And it just doesn't work like that. I mean, I don't think it works like that under normal circumstances. It certainly doesn't work like that when the Argentine authorities were taking over what was then a British colony.
As the Argentines took control on that first day, the islanders, desperate for information, tuned into their local radio station. But the presenter suddenly went from reading the news to being the news.
If you take the gun out of my back, I'm going to transmit that news. If you take the gun away. But I'm not speaking with the gun in my back.
I believe it was about 9 o'clock in the morning when they finally walked into the radio station. And I was a little bit nervous then, because for the first time since I opened up that microphone fader hours and hours before and asked the people to call me, I suddenly thought, will they come in, say, all guns blazing, a bit just to destroy the equipment or something, you know? But they didn't. They wanted the equipment, and they wanted me, because I was useful to them to play their tapes, which they had prepared, meticulously prepared tapes in English and Spanish.
The Argentine tapes laid down the new rules that the islanders must obey. Over the coming weeks, 4x4s were to be confiscated for Argentine military use. The name of Stanley was to be changed, and there would be no more driving on the left.
I remember we were driving down Ross Road one day, and there was a vehicle coming down the other side of the road. So essentially, you know, we were going to run into each other if they didn't move. And my husband stuck to his guns, and he just stopped the vehicle, and he wouldn't move to the other side. In the end, it was the Argentine vehicle that pulled over and had to go to the other side of the road. So yes, there was a feeling of defiance, and I remember sitting there quite frightened about the whole thing, thinking, are they going to shoot us now, you know, because we've done this?
The children, too, were struggling to make sense of the new regime.
We passed some soldiers walking down the street, and they were ripping their badges off their uniform to give them to us, to be friendly. And it was very confusing. So on one hand you knew you'd been taken over by a foreign force, and on the other hand they were trying to be friendly to the children. But of course, now as an adult, I know that they believed they were coming to liberate us.
I remember going to the mirror and looking in the mirror and looking at myself and wondering if I was going to look different, because according to what I heard on the radio, I was now Argentine.
Lisa's father, Neil Watson, felt no such confusion. As a seventh-generation Falkland Islander, his family can be traced back to the 1840 pioneers. Neil fiercely opposed the Argentine sovereignty claim and is staunchly proud of his British roots.
I haven't got red blood in my veins, I've got red, white and blue blood in my veins. And I think 99% of the Falkland Islanders felt the same. I just felt so bloody angry about it all. There they were, in my country, at that time, doing what they were doing. Can't really explain how I felt, apart from anger and hatred is a very strong word, but it was there. It really was.
With the Argentine troops well and truly dug in and controlling Stanley, there was the problem of what to do with the governor, Rex Hunt. It was decided to deport him, leaving the islanders to their fate.
I was very worried for the islanders. I thought the Argentines, some of them were very hard, and there would be a lot of trouble with the islanders who wouldn't do what the Argentines would tell them. We drove from Stanley to the airfield. The islanders were coming out of their houses, and quite a number were crying as we went past, as we went out. So yes, I felt that there was something not done properly, and the sooner I could get back, the better.
I took Rex and Mavis down to the airport, and then they come and said goodbye to me, and they got on the plane. And I remember Rex saying to me when he left, he said, he leant over and said, "Don't you worry, we'll be back." And I drove back to Government House with an Argentine officer sitting behind me. He got out, I got the taxi in the garage and locked the garage door. And he put his hand out for the key, so I gave him another key that wouldn't fit the bloody lock.
With the last symbol of British rule gone, the Falkland Islanders were now abandoned and at the mercy of a fascist regime. But the Argentines quickly set about winning the hearts and minds of the conquered islanders.
We had never had television before. But the Argentines had brought televisions over and wanted people to buy them, and I said, well, we're not buying them. We don't want them. And the old priest said to my son, you buy one of those, he said. It's on HP, you're only going to have to pay £10 and then they'll be gone and you'll have a free television. So everybody did that. They went and collected a television set. And in a sense it was good because we could then tune in. We got some of the world news. It was on cartoons in the morning for the children for a couple of hours. In the evening we could even see the BBC News.
The best piece of news the islanders heard was on the 5th of April. The British government had finally responded to the crisis.
My neighbour came out and he said, haven't you heard? They're sending a task force to liberate us. It'll be easy. They've got nothing, the Argentinians. And I just could not... The change in my attitude was incredible. Suddenly, I felt great. The British are coming.
With the task force on the way, the Argentines were determined to crush any sign of rebellion. A military intelligence unit was set up on the islands, run by a man whose name would strike fear into the islanders' hearts. Major Patricio Dowling.
The first meeting with Major Dowling was difficult. We sat down and he basically told me my life story. I'd spent up to 2 years in Argentina at school. He knew all about that. He knew my parents, he knew my family, he knew everything there was to know about me at that time. I always had it in the back of my mind, you know, this man is particularly dangerous, and don't do anything silly because he wouldn't hesitate to harm one, I'm sure.
Major Dowling made no secret of the fact that he hated the islanders. He made it clear just how far he was prepared to go.
But Dowling used to wander into the hotel whenever he felt like it. And I can remember he didn't know that some of us spoke Spanish or understood Spanish. And he was sitting at this table with some Argentines and they were discussing what was going to happen next. And he said that probably the best solution would be to kill all the Falkland Islanders, and then there wouldn't be a population to worry about. So, you know, like eradication was the answer. And I can remember thinking, this, you know, he's not joking, he's serious.
A few weeks into the occupation, it was clear that the situation was rapidly getting worse. The Argentine occupation was becoming more oppressive. The islanders had to take action to protect themselves. It was time to fight back. The Argentine military had now occupied the Falklands for several weeks. The seat of government, the radio station and the airport were all under their control. But the islanders were determined not to make life easy for the Argentines. One man in particular was fighting back. Terry Peck was the island's former chief of police. He put his old skills to good use, covertly photographing the invading troops. But his activities had not gone unnoticed by the Argentine military police.
I'd overheard a conversation to the effect that they were going to go and arrest Terry Peck and take him in for interrogation. And knowing Terry and what he was like and knowing that he'd been out photographing and that, and my first thought was, we can't let this happen. We've got to get, I've got to get Terry away.
Terry needed to escape from Stanley before he was caught. But the Argentine forces were everywhere. Getting out was not going to be easy.
Terry came to me and asked me if I could get him out of town. So I found a way out, which was out round past Pony's Pass, over the mountain down to Corners Pass.
Terry spent the next few nights hiding in barns and outhouses. His intention was to meet up with the British troops when they arrived with the task force. He would become the key figure in the island's resistance.
I take him, make ration packs and drop off for him. Especially one night I'll always remember, I dropped his ration packs off where, at the stated place, and it was coming in dark, very thick fog, damp night. Just getting back to Land Rover, and this deep voice come out of the dark. Good evening, Pat, and I reckon I nearly jumped 4 feet in the air. And it was Terry just coming for his food. And that's the biggest scare I had in the whole conflict, I can get.
Terry decided to make his way to Long Island Farm, where he knew his friends, the Watsons, would give him shelter. But someone had got there before him.
But about 8 o'clock in the morning, I saw some guys in camouflage uniforms carrying weapons. There were 6 of them, and oh my God, this was the first Argentine patrol to hit us.
It was the 6 Royal Marines, who were ordered away from Stanley minutes before the surrender to carry out a guerrilla campaign.
I made them very, very welcome. They were cold. We gave them food, hot drinks. I think a few of them had a bath, actually. Change of clothes.
Guerrilla tactics had not been successful. The Marines were divided about what to do next.
We had a long, long chat. There was a difference of opinion about what to do. There was some of them wanted to just go back out into the hills and put up some resistance. And there's 3 older boys there, and they said, look, we're not on Dartmoor. This is no bloody exercise. They'll have helicopters out there, they'll have dogs out there. There's 6 of us, and there's probably thousands of Argentine troops in Stanley. They will hunt us down. They said, look, if we're loose, if we're out there, 6 armed men, it's going to give the islanders, the farmers in this area, a lot more hassle from the Argentinians. And they were absolutely right. So common sense, I think, prevailed. So they said, look, we'll surrender.
They may have decided to surrender, but they were not going to let their weapons fall into enemy hands.
There's 5 SLRs and 5 rifles. There was a fair number of grenades and a couple of light anti-tank weapons. So we went and buried them, went up the sand beach and buried them.
The Watsons then contacted the Argentine authorities, who sent troops to Long Island to take the Marines away.
I think we were told to tell them that they had to go out, stand outside the house and be seen, put their weapons away and be seen. And a helicopter came down and Argentine troops ran out, surrounded the house, dragged the Royal Marines over to the back of our house and threw them on the ground, and I think they may have tied them up. But the worst thing, actually, the really upsetting thing was my mother and I were looking out the window from upstairs, and we saw them standing on their backs and having their photographs taken with their feet on the Marines' backs, and it was just really disgusting. My mum was really upset by that.
With the last of the Marines gone, resistance against the Argentines now fell to the islanders alone. Graham Bound was the editor of the island's newspaper.
I think when the dust settled, people then started to have a very strange mix of emotions. They were certainly still afraid of what was to come, but also they were angry and frustrated and to some extent humiliated. And there was a natural desire to do something about it. So some people started producing posters which appeared as if by magic around the town, and every time they were ripped off by the Argentines, they would appear again. One poster that really sticks in my mind was that of a very cliched-looking Argentine being booted to a Marine who in turn cartwheels him into a rubbish bin. And that did put a smile on your face.
But the resistance didn't end with a few posters. Many islanders became spies, risking their necks to obtain information that could help the British forces.
One of the main characters here at the time was Steve Whitley, who at that time was the vet. And because of that, he was able to go to places where others couldn't, on the pretext of looking after his animals. And he then invited other people to come along and help with, I suppose we could call it intelligence gathering, to be quite covert. So the system developed where Steve would sort of be the driver. I was the decoy man, and there were others who were either recording or just watching, you know, trying to measure things like size of gun barrel and bore. And to be honest, I don't think we knew what we were doing. It was kind of a way of getting back at the Argentines and maybe getting information that will help the British. Once the intelligence gathering sort of took off, it then became, well, while we're doing this, we can actually do other things, like a little bit of, I suppose the sabotage would be the word, where Steve in particular has got a very large pair of scissors, which, being a vet, I won't go into detail as to what he used them for, but they were very effective. But they're also very effective at cutting telephone wires. And so there was another opportunity. There just seemed to be telephone wires everywhere. It was kind of too much of a temptation, shall we put it that way, that if you're tripping over telephone wires, why not cut them?
The main method of communication on the Falkland Islands was amateur radio. The Argentines were aware that these ham radios could be used to give information to the British forces. They demanded that the aerials were taken down and devices handed in. But one man was determined to stay in touch with the outside world. Reg Sylvie kept a radio set hidden away and came up with an ingenious makeshift aerial made from washing line and a length of cable.
This worked quite well, and I was able to disconnect it at any time, very short notice. Each transmission I kept as short as possible, perhaps no more than 10 seconds. This was obviously to stop the Argentines getting a good fix on my transmission.
The Argentines tried desperately to find the secret radio ham, but Reg continued to evade them. The messages he transmitted contained important information for the British government.
I tried to make obvious that various points around Stanley had been fortified in various ways with anti-aircraft guns, missile emplacements, and also I gave them information about the airfield.
Reg's messages were being picked up 8,000 miles away in Bridlington, Yorkshire, by Bob North, who in turn passed them on to the Ministry of Defence.
During the transmission, Reg gave me some coordinates, which were map references of the aerodrome, and also that the aerodrome was free of civilians and could be bombed at any particular time in safety without any damage to the civilian life there.
The Argentine authorities made it clear that whoever was sending these messages would be found and shot. Reg chose to ignore the warning.
I think what Reg was doing was a very dangerous thing to have to do, because if he'd been caught, he could have been shot as a spy, really.
Of all the military intelligence, I suppose you could call it, I sent to Bob North, I would like to think that some of it had an effect. For instance, I'd sent details about the airfield, and within days it had been bombed.
On the 1st of May, the British bombed Stanley Airport. The battle for the Falklands had well and truly begun. The Argentines were determined to make sure the British didn't get any more help from the islanders. A new hardline approach came into force. Life for the islanders was about to get very much worse. On the 2nd of April 1982, the Argentines invaded the Falklands. They had occupied the islands for 30 days. They were under attack from the air by the British, and on the ground, the islanders were organizing resistance. There was a new hardline stance towards the local population.
On the day that I saw some young lads lying on the road with the Argentinians standing over them with rifles on their heads, I really got nervous and afraid for the civilian population, and I really thought, this is different. From now on, we were the enemy as well, and we were all being treated with suspicion. That it was no more being friendly and everything's going to be fine, and it's all going to turn out okay, everybody. Message to the world, the islanders are happy with us being here. It was suddenly different. I think they really knew then that the war had really started.
After the bombing of the airport, the British tried to make contact with the Argentines, hoping they would surrender. They received no reply, but the message had been picked up by farmer Robin Pitaluga on his radio. He tried to help.
At that time we weren't sure the Argentines would be interested in discussing a surrender. It was rather early in the conflict, but it was worth a try, just in case the problem was radio communications. And so we set about doing something that we'd always done during the years of radio-telephone communications, help out.
Robin contacted HMS Hermes and offered to act as a go-between, trying to get the message through to the Argentines. But his radio contact with the British had been monitored by the Argentine military. He was now in serious trouble.
We were having lunch when two very large helicopters arrived. Loads of Argentine troops spilled out of both, surrounded everything and everyone on the settlement. They said I was under arrest and I would have to go to Stanley and explain what I'd been up to in communicating with the British forces.
Robin was flown from his home in the North Camp to Stanley for interrogation by the military police.
At first, at the police station, I was just told to sit on a chair and remain and not move, and a soldier was put there to guard me. And then a really nasty officer arrived, a real gorilla of a fellow. He started pushing me around and then ordered me to go down towards the sea wall. On the sea wall, he told me to stop, face the sea, and at that point he put his pistol, which was a real Clint Eastwood-sized thing, against the back of my neck, and started operating the mechanism. I thought, well, this is it. Sooner or later he's going to find a bullet that goes off. I wasn't afraid to die. I just felt sort of quite numb at that stage. I felt very sorry that I was going to die and not be able to say a proper goodbye to my family. When would they know about it, if ever?
The Argentines would use these mock executions on other occasions to frighten the islanders into submission. They also began to target those identified as potential troublemakers, such as Bill Luxton, known for his strong opposition to the Argentine sovereignty claim.
And we were quietly minding our own business at home, and this helicopter came very low over the hill, landed right in front of the house. About 20 armed special forces jumped out and sort of ran in both directions and surrounded the house, all kneeling down with their guns pointing towards it. Unfortunately for them, I wasn't in the house at the time. I was about 300 or 400 yards away. I saw this all happening. Pat, my late wife, and Stephen, they were in the house, and so I came running over to this lot, stopped by the first one, and said, "Are you looking for me?"
Bill Luxton and Dick Baker were deported. But getting rid of the troublemakers was a big mistake. The two exiles made sure the world knew what was happening. They went straight to the European Parliament.
One of the parliamentarians said, "Look, why do you want to make such a big fuss about these little islands? They're of no great value. Why do you so resent being occupied and invaded?" Silly question, really. And I looked at Bill. It was obviously one for him. And he said simply, "Because it's our home." And I thought that was just about it. It was the perfect answer to that question.
The plan to silence Bill by deporting him had backfired.
After a few days, they suddenly realized that they had two hostiles at loose in the rest of the world, doing their best to get in front of any television camera they could or talk as much as they could about the situation. And they decided that the rest of the troublemakers, they would keep firmly in the Falklands under lock and key.
The Argentine secret police arrested 14 people who were seen as a potential threat. They were taken from their homes at gunpoint.
There was no indication at all why we were arrested. It was quite a mystery that I learned later. 3 of us were members of the Falkland Defence Force, and I was also a member of the Falkland Association. And the association had been formed really to keep the Falklands British. We had meetings, we had people in the Parliament who was trying to keep an eye on things.
I have no idea why I was arrested. I don't know of any reason for it. I had been a councillor. I was a young councillor, and I had been outspoken in opposition to the Argentines having anything to do with the Falkland Islands. But I'd been by no means the only person saying those things.
The prisoners were flown out of Stanley, still with no idea where they were heading. Many feared the worst.
It was a very worrying time because these people who were taking us away had been throwing their people who opposed them out of aircraft into the River Plate. It was not at all a nice feeling to be in their power and to be in a helicopter. We did not know where we were going initially.
After an extremely tense journey, the exiles finally landed at Fox Bay, a remote farm settlement on West Falkland. They were locked away here for the rest of the war.
There was 19 of us living in the house. Everybody was really sterling. I mean, we all recognized that we were in the same boat.
From the outset, the Argentine officer in charge made it clear that any resistance would have only one outcome.
I remember quite clearly he said, "I've been killing people in Argentina for 10 years, and I hope that I don't have to kill you." And there was no mistaking that message. We were not allowed out of the immediate grounds of the house, and we stayed within those grounds for all the time we were there. It was dangerous, in fact, to leave. There were a lot of soldiers around, and certainly at night you would not have done because they were extremely nervous soldiers.
I got permission to go out to our boat and get some of the bedding off our boat. We had a boat in the creek. I got permission, and so I went out with a couple of others, actually. We got out there, picked up the bedding, and everything seemed quite relaxed. On the way back, somebody opened up on us with an automatic rifle. There was one bullet passed between Gerald Cheek and myself. We were standing about 2 feet apart, and one bullet actually went between us. We were very lucky that day.
On one particularly frightening occasion, the Argentines took everyone from the house at gunpoint and marched them into the shearing shed.
Do you remember there was a sergeant standing here with a bloody great gun pointing at us?
Right. But I remember it was a particularly tense moment, wasn't it? Because
this was
for
very
whatever
tense.
reason they were tense, and it was clear there was a seriousness.
The sergeant at the door called me out again and said, "You must tell these people not to move from that area because these men have been told to shoot you." And there were actually tears in his eyes. And I said,
including the children?
Including the children. I said, "Don't worry, we are not moving."
Fox Bay was the major centre of Argentine troops on West Falkland and came under daily attack by British Harriers and naval gunfire. With no way to escape, the prisoners needed some sort of shelter.
Remember this is the only hatchway that's still open down to the old bunker there.
Looks a lot smaller than I recall it.
We used to call it the hole, wasn't it?
That's right.
Get in the hole. I think we used to get down here quite quick when the Harrier attack used to come in. Yeah.
I came down with my wife and the two small children, and it doesn't seem possible looking at the size of it now. But
I know.
We did.
The escape hatch was just behind you there.
Just here,
It's
that's right,
you can still see
yes,
where there's
yes.
chinks in the rock where it's been repaired.
Yeah.
But that was just loose, so you could just boot it out.
Really, I don't know how we managed to stay down there for so long.
I know,
One night would have been difficult, but 4 weeks seems impossible now. But I guess we were glad to have the shelter at the time.
With the British forces drawing ever closer, the Argentine troops at Fox Bay took measures to defend the perimeter of the settlement. They laid minefields.
In the centre there, just over there, you'll see where our cemetery was. This was the village or the settlement cemetery, and nobody can go there anymore. It's just, it's totally unsafe, and so until people find a way of clearing mines, this is just going to have to stay as it is. The families find it quite difficult that their loved ones are in the cemetery which is just falling to pieces.
But the Fox Bay prisoners were far from the only prisoners on the islands. Over on East Falkland, another farming community was to become famous for its prison and for the battle that liberated it. It was called Goose Green. Before the Falklands War of 1982, very few people had heard of Goose Green, a peaceful farm settlement on East Falkland.
Life at Goose Green pre-1982 to me was very quiet. And as a child, I spent my time entertaining myself because we had no TV back then. I grew up remembering I can just go anywhere at any time and being very quiet, very nice for a child to grow up in that environment.
With its flat farmland and the added advantage of long grass airstrips, Goose Green was an attractive prospect for an invading army.
I thought, well, if Argentines invade Stanley, which they did on the early morning of the 2nd of April, it would take them 2 days to consolidate their position, and then they would be moving out into the next two bigger settlements outside of Stanley, Goose Green on the East Falklands and Fox Bay on the West Falklands.
Eric was right. Within the first week of the war, 1,000 Argentine troops had arrived at Goose Green and occupied the settlement.
We were all summoned to meet up at the head of the jetty and hand in our firearms and give our names. They had a roll call there.
For the first few weeks, the invading troops treated the island as well. But on the 1st of May, there was a British airstrike on Goose Green. The Argentines had a change of attitude.
I was standing looking out of the window, and out of nowhere appeared two very fast-moving objects, if you like. There was two British Harriers, and they hit the airport there because the Argentinians had established an air base in Goose Green, or just outside the settlement.
I'd never heard anything like it in my life, and of course we woke up absolutely petrified. And I remember my mum jumping out of, to get up, and my dad grabbing her back down and say, stay down, you don't know what's going to happen, we don't know what's going to happen. And then of course we could hear, all the bombing, we could hear the bombs being dropped and the explosions and everything like that.
They'd hit the napalm bombs that were stored up there. That went off. It took all the oxygen out of my chest, and it was a hell of a sensation.
we waited and we waited until everything had gone silent before we got up. And when we got up, we went out into the lawn and we could see, you know, all the mayhem at the airstrip and people running around and planes on fire and things like that. And, you know, feeling, on one hand, really excited because that was a British jet, but on the other hand, feeling petrified because, you know, now there was actually a visible act of war in front of us.
11 Argentine air and ground crew were killed and 10 aircraft destroyed in the attack. The Argentines took their revenge on the islanders.
They thought one of us had actually directed this attack into Goose Green, and the only way that they could secure that, if you like, was to contain all of the people, so contain the risk, if you like.
All I remember is a group of armed officers with their guns pointing, coming to the house and ordering us out of the house. And they gathered us all at the end of our road with some other families from houses around us, and then told us we had to go to the social club.
They were quite forceful, and it was scary, and the children were naturally frightened. But we did as we were told because we had no option. They were armed. They had what I would have called a Nazi-orientated discipline about them, and we didn't know what was going to happen next. We were frightened for what they might do to the children or the women or even ourselves. We didn't know whether they would use us as hostages. That was my biggest personal fear. They would use us as a hostage and say, look, you either turn the task force around or we're going to do away with the hostages. That was my biggest fear.
The moment we all went into the hall, the conscripts came around with their rifles, and there was 2 at the door and 1 at every window. The whole place was circled with armed guards, and nobody was allowed out. We were there all day, 115 of us, 1 4-month-old baby.
I felt like I was in a prison because we'd been told we had to stay there and we weren't allowed out, and there were guards there, and I do remember them soldiers peering in the windows, and they had guns, so we knew not to step outside, and we didn't have anything to protect ourselves. We were very much prison.
114 people would be kept in this small hall for a month, with no beds, little food, and only 2 toilets. The conditions in which they were held were in clear violation of the Geneva Convention.
We didn't get any food for the first few days. We were living on nibbles from the bar, and then we got spam, crackers and cold beans, which I'll never eat till the day I die as a result, and that was our meal, you know, 3 times a day for a number of days.
Conditions got worse as the days went by.
We only had 2 toilets, and of course with people getting dysentery there was queues at the doors, and the toilet paper run out, so newspapers don't flush away too good, and they all blocked up.
While they were locked in the hall, there were further British airstrikes on Goose Green, one of which was witnessed by Eric Goss.
The sirens went off, the guns all started blazing. This is the anti-aircraft guns. They were putting up 5 rapid shots that would explode at 5,000 feet, 4,000 feet, 3,000 feet, and this Harrier come up the sound over the settlement, run into this wall of rubbish, and I guess the pilot was killed instantly in the air, and he crashed into the ground not far from the Dutch barn.
Flight Lieutenant Nick Taylor was the first British casualty at Goose Green. Once the British troops landed on the 21st of May, the battle intensified. The prisoners were still not allowed to leave the flimsy building. Terrified of an accidental strike on the hall, they ripped up floorboards to make bunkers.
For me, the scariest time was the last few days when the key battle took place. We were under the floorboards and we could hear the whole battle like it was right outside the door, and it was petrifying, absolutely petrifying. And I remember trying to sleep, and every time a bomb went off, actually physically lifting off the floor.
By the morning of the 29th of May, there had been 9 solid nights of naval bombardment. Then suddenly, there was silence.
When we looked out the windows, we could see all of the Argentine troops trooping down. There were no British, we couldn't see any British. It was a bit strange because as a child I was thinking, well, why are they surrendering? I can't see any British soldiers, you know, with their guns pointed at them. But actually when you looked further to the north towards where the barn was, you could see many people up there, and I don't know why, but I sort of knew that they must be British, because why else would the Argentines be laying down all their guns? And so I watched it. I was at my mum's elbow and I watched the surrender and them all coming in and feeling just hugely excited and relieved. I think the most exciting though was when we actually physically got outside the hall for the first time and all the paras came up to us, those poor guys, absolutely, you know, exhausted. And they were excited to see us as well. I felt like that anyway, certainly as a child, and we were really thrilled. And then, very importantly, their flag was raised, the British flag was raised.
But as the islanders left their prison and went back to their houses, they were confronted by the aftermath of the occupation.
The houses were filthy, they were dirty, they'd been walked in with muddy boots on. Muddy boots had been still on the soldiers when they laid on their beds. There was human excrement all over the place. The pans were full, the toilet pan, the baths were used as a toilet, crap on the beds and on the sofas and the chairs. It was really animalised.
All around Goose Green, the horror of war was all too clear.
When we got in, the first thing I found was the nose cone for Nick Taylor's Harrier, which was engraved obviously by the people who'd shot him down. It had the time, the date, and his details on it. And that was in our front porch when we got back to the house.
Well, to see a lot of dead and mutilated human remains and bodies scattered about all over the place, I remember I said to my wife, I'm going to take the children with me and let them see for themselves what war's all about.
My son, 15-year-old son Morgan, was with me, and as we were going past the dairy parlour, we saw 3 Argentinian corpses there, and laying amongst them on his back with his bonnet over his face was a paratrooper. And young Morgan says, "Look, there's more bodies there, Dad." "Oh, Christ, and there's one of ours," he said. And that was a bit disturbing.
Goose Green was now liberated, but the main settlement of Stanley was still under Argentine occupation. The British pushed forward to liberate it. The islanders were again to play a crucial role, risking their lives to help. On the 29th of May, 1982, 67 days after the Argentines first invaded the Falklands, the British had won back Goose Green after a fierce battle, but Stanley was still in the hands of the Argentines.
Stanley at that time was under an increasingly tight siege, so that the British were tightening the noose on it, and we could see the Argentines becoming more and more demoralised, going more and more hungry, more and more desperate. And to be honest, we were getting a bit desperate too, because the town was coming under very heavy attack from artillery in the mountains, Harriers bombing the town during the day, and then every night the Navy coming in to shell the place. So it was a grim time, and we just thought we were just counting the days.
One islander was still hiding out in the Falklands camp. Former Police Chief Terry Peck, with the help of a new identity, had evaded the Argentines for several weeks. He was about to learn something that would help the British retake Stanley.
Terry Peck came to our farm. We were very happy to see him, obviously, and we're going to help him out because we actually had quite a large stash of weapons on our farm that had been left behind by the 6 Royal Marines that had stayed with us. It wasn't just semi-automatic machine guns, it was rocket launchers and grenades and probably some other little bits and pieces that I didn't quite understand. But what had happened, they'd been buried at the head of the sand beach, which was about a mile from our house. So just for safety really, so that the Argentine troops couldn't find them in our house, because obviously they kept searching our house.
Immediately a plan was hatched to dig up the weapons, but it was very risky.
We knew this could go pear-shaped because where the Argentine positions were, on Long Island Mountain, where we had to dig the weapons up, we were in direct line of sight, and it would only be about half a mile away from them. So if they had night scopes, they could have seen us. But we thought, hell with it, let's go and do it.
The operation was successful, and the weapons were taken back to the Watsons' farm.
When Terry decided to move on, he took one of those weapons with him, and quite a supply of ammunition. He took a .762 SLR, as they were known, which was a basic infantry rifle at that time for the British Army.
Terry headed towards Port San Carlos and the British forces, determined to do everything he could to help. The paratroopers aimed to regain control of Mount Longdon, one of the mountains to the west of Stanley. They had reached the settlement of Estancia. This farm would become their base of operation as they prepared to attack.
Well, the guys had really bad footwear, boots that didn't keep their feet dry, basically, and they must have been wet, I suppose, from when they left the ships in San Carlos water until they got here. And they just arrived with terrible bad trench foot, and they were sort of taking laces out of their boots and trying to cut them open as far as they could and hobbling around on the sides of their feet. They must have been in agony. Once the troops arrived here, we couldn't really keep any meat going. We actually killed some sheep for them one night and hung up and said, leave them to set and then we'll cut them up tomorrow. But they were so desperate for something fresh to eat that it was all gone before it had finished kicking nearly, I think.
On the 25th of May, the Argentines sunk the Atlantic conveyor, carrying the Chinook supply helicopters. The British now had limited means of supplying their troops as they advanced on Stanley. But Terry knew where to find help, an old friend.
I come in from outside with a basket full of washing, and as I come in the door, I looked across the window and I said, bloody hell, it's Terry Peck. What's he doing here?
Terry's plan was for Trudy to ask all the local farmers to help out with support for the British troops.
He asked us, could we get as many tractors and trailers and rovers together and meet him at the Estancia? So that's what we did. I mean, everybody was so generous, you know, take our vehicles, take our tractors, and we were sort of all ready to go the next morning.
The convoy set off at first light. Trudy went with them, the only woman on a dangerous mission.
If there was any way that I could help the British get rid of them, there was no way I was going to stay at home. I mean, when we went to pick up the rovers and that, I wanted one of those rovers to go and do my bit.
Fortunately, the weather was on their side.
There was the kind of fog where it was sort of thick on the land, but yet, you know, you could see the tops of the mountains. It was almost like if somebody was giving us a helping hand, really.
They made their way across the hills to join Terry and the British Army at Estancia. It was a long drive across treacherous terrain.
For somebody who's never driven over Falklands Camp, I suppose it's very difficult to try and explain what it's like, but basically you need quite a bit of experience. It's not just something you can jump in a Land Rover and take off.
Estancia Farm was in a straight line for the advance on Stanley. Trudy's fighting farmers were given orders to keep the British troops supplied, going backwards and forwards with rations, water, ammunition and medical supplies.
It was pretty tough going because it was winter, and everywhere was so wet, and we used to have to take rations to A, B, and C company, and you'd be away all day. And as for food, well, I lived on Mars bars and cigarettes, so it done wonders for my waistline. Perhaps we should have another rerun, I guess.
For almost a fortnight, the islanders kept the supplies flowing to the front line, often driving through the night without lights for fear of being spotted by the Argentines.
Roger Patton, the second in command, came around and he said, "Trudy, do you know of a civilian that would be prepared to walk in front of the convoy?" And I said, "Well, I'll do it." Because, I felt if I was walking, I was sort of very conscious that if I bogged the vehicle, it would be a delay. So I said, "Okay," he said, "I'll give you a pair of white gloves." And he said, the white gloves, if you can walk with your hands behind your back, because there was no lights, but, white, you can always see white in the dark. And the first rover followed my white gloves. The first time they mentioned we might stand on mines or booby traps was as we were getting down close to the Murrell River. And they come back and they said, "Now you might stand on mines or booby traps." And I mean, it's not being brave, it's just that I was there doing it and I just felt I wanted to do it.
The farmers reached the front line at the base of Mount Longdon, where they waited to help with the wounded. It was a dangerous place to be.
They opened fire on us from, I don't know if it was Longdon or the Two Sisters, and these shells sort of come in. It was dark and all you heard was the whistle and the bang, and you thought then, this is getting a bit close.
This was their first taste of battle.
It just looked like someone there with a giant shovel and throwing these red hot coals up the side of the mountain, and that was with the shells and mortar exploding on the mountain. And then hundreds of tracer bullets you could see. It's just something you've got to see to believe. You couldn't possibly imagine that it could be so much fire going in one area at one time.
Pat Whitney was given the huge responsibility of getting the medics to the front line.
If I didn't get through, I mean, the wounded weren't going to get the attention they urgently needed from the medics. It was big, heaviest weight I've ever carried on my shoulders in my life, and practically will be the heaviest I ever will do.
Neil Watson had just arrived at the front line with paratrooper Scotty Wilson, who was ready to go into battle.
There's no doubt in his mind that this was going to be the final push. In 2 days he'd be in Stanley, and a day later he'd be on a boat sailing back to UK. And I knew him for about 6 hours, but you can get to know someone so well, especially in those circumstances, so well. So I found out that Scotty was killed next morning. So sad.
Terry Peck had led the Paras right into the Argentine lines on Mount Longdon and was now helping to carry down the first of the wounded.
When we got across the Murrell, someone got bogged in and I was going to pull them out, and I said, "No, we're all the medics aboard now." So they all flocked into my rover. And I knew then that Terry had carried the first casualty back on his shoulder. Some young para who, very unfortunately, didn't make it, I don't think.
We spent the rest of the night until 5 in the morning getting the wounded out. They used to bring them in BVs and just trying to get someone out of the back of a BV that's had their leg blown off. The screams, it was a nightmare.
Aided by Terry Peck's knowledge of the terrain, the British troops gradually overpowered the Argentines and moved closer to the outskirts of Stanley. The islanders of this little town were to find themselves in the middle of the battle. Some of them would not survive. The Falklands had been occupied by the Argentines for 70 days. But now the British troops had reached the outskirts of the capital, Stanley. The islanders were in the heart of the battle. They were also in the line of fire.
During the hours of curfew, of darkness, you could hear things going on, and you could hear bombs, and you heard firing, and you heard, we had a machine gun post just outside the house, and occasionally whichever cold young conscript was manning that would fire off a few rounds across the harbour at Loggerducks, or his mates on the other side or whatever. So there was a lot of feeling that really nasty, dangerous things were coming very, very close.
At the time, Phil Middleton made a recording of the nightly bombardment by the British Navy.
It's coming straight over my head. Well, I certainly hope their spotting is good, because some of those have landed in town. Could well be. We know exactly what they're doing, but certainly some of those are in town. And very, very close to houses. All the lights have gone out now in Stanley. A lot of shelling going on.
It would take them something like 4 hours steaming time to come into Stanley, get to the gun line, and then they would steam up the gun line, and you could hear this pop, and it was like a cue hitting a billiard ball. There was a distinctive pop, and you would hear this pop going on. It was pop, 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 and then there would be a pause, and there would be a pop, 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 pop.
As the British drew closer, the fighting intensified. The Argentine army was in a state of panic.
The last 3 days and nights were horrendous. They were the worst of the whole war. Argentinian shells going out, hitting the mountains that the British had taken. The battles didn't finish once the mountains were taken. And then the British firing in to Stanley, trying to take out the Argentinian artillery that was giving them so much trouble. Just this noise, the thumps and the whistles, minute after minute, hour after hour, for 3 days and nights. And houses being hit, other houses being hit and taken out. Fire.
It was just before midnight on the 11th of June when tragedy struck. The British warship, HMS Avenger, accidentally shelled a house in Stanley.
The impact, the explosion, when it came was just total. It just was sensory overload. I mean, you couldn't say you heard it, you couldn't say you felt it. It was just there. It was just tremendous.
Amongst the people sheltering in the house was Steve Whitley, the island vet, and his wife, Sue.
Steve asked me to help him with Sue. I remember trying to find a mirror, trying to find out whether she was breathing, and she was not. She was clearly dead.
Also killed instantly was Doreen Bonner, who was with her husband and daughter.
The thing that struck me most immediately was that her glasses were totally dusty, and it would have been impossible to see out of them. And it struck me that that was a kind of strange sign that she was dead, because if she had been alive and conscious, the first reflex would have been to be able to see. I remember my daughter waking up and saying, "Is this a bad day, Daddy?" And there was only one answer to that it was a terrible day.
The tragedy killed Sue Whitley, Doreen Bonner, and a third woman, Mary Ann Goodwin, who died later in hospital. But their deaths were to destroy other lives as well. Doreen Bonner's husband, Harry, was heartbroken by her death and died 12 months later, leaving their disabled daughter, Cheryl, an orphan. With bloodshed all around and the constant British bombardment, the Argentines were finally beaten.
I looked out of the window, snowflakes falling gently, and it was just like someone flicked a switch and turned the noise off. It was almost like everybody at the same time, simultaneously, stopped firing. And then there was a strange, eerie silence, and you wondered what was going on. And after a while, I couldn't contain myself, and I ventured outside. And I could see Argentinians heading east, coming off the mountains on the west, heading through Stanley.
After fierce fighting had engulfed the town for weeks, the Argentine army were retreating.
I remember standing outside the house watching a fire of Argentine conscripts, very, very crestfallen sort of people, and Rachel suddenly saying, "Are they bad men, Daddy?" And in the end I had to say, well, we don't know them. Some of them may be bad men, and some of them may be really nice men, but what we do know is that they're caught up in a really bad situation.
Finally, on the 14th of June 1982, after 74 days of occupation, Stanley was liberated.
One of the really lovely, iconic moments was knowing that the flag was going up again at Government House, and more importantly, that it was being pulled up by some of Mike Norman's Marines, the same guys who'd been thrown out by the Argentines on the 2nd of April 1982, after, really putting up a tremendously brave defence. So there was a nice justice about that.
The elation that day, meeting people on the street. I remember meeting Eileen Vidal and chatting to her, and we were trying to describe it to each other how we felt, and I kind of just remember saying to her, it just feels like 100 Christmases rolled up in one. It's very difficult to describe.
But along with the feelings of joy at being liberated, the reality of the destruction and the cost of the war set in.
The neat little town of Stanley had actually been wrecked. We had lots of troops coming through. The Argentines were pushed through Stanley as the British forces came over the hills, and so they were throwing things. They were dropping litter, which was more than just litter. It was ammunition, it was food, it was their horrible wet clothing. The mud was everywhere, and the all-pervading smell.
It was a remarkable victory for the British. Terry Peck was with the paratroopers as they entered Stanley. He was made an honorary para and marched alongside them in the victory parade. Terry died in December 2006. For the islanders, there are the visual reminders of the enormous losses suffered on both sides of the war. These simple crosses on a hillside mark the 693 Argentine soldiers who died. This memorial in Stanley is for the 255 British servicemen who gave their lives to reclaim the Falkland Islands. Many of the islanders are haunted by what they saw to this day.
I think the time of year when I feel the most emotional is really when we have our, we have a memorial at the Para Cross at Darwin, and, we toast all of those men who laid down their lives giving us back our freedom, and I feel very emotional about that, and I also feel very emotional about all of those of us who aren't with us anymore.
Here, on the remote Sea Lion Island, is the humble grave of Sue Whitley, one of the civilians killed during the conflict and a testament to the human tragedy of the war. All those who lost their lives in the war remain in the hearts of the Falkland Islanders.
we'll never forget the ones that died for us. And we always feel very sad about that. To their mums and dads, and because everybody's somebody's son or daughter. We'll never forget them.